It was one of those surreal nights that seemed like a scene straight out of a political satire. Except it was real. The kind of evening that made you double take and wonder how on earth these people ended up in the same room, sharing appetizers and awkward laughs. The dinner had a strange energy from the beginning, with an almost cinematic quality to it. You could feel that the room was filled with personalities too big to fit around a single table, and yet somehow they were all there, trying to act like this was normal. The setting wasn't extravagant, definitely upscale but not flashy. It was the kind of place that tried to be both exclusive and low-key, where the lighting is dim enough to make powerful people feel a little more anonymous. But anonymity was impossible with this group. The moment the guests arrived, the staff couldn't help but sneak glances. After all, it's not every day you see an aging rock star with a cowboy hat walk in like he owns the place, followed by a man whose presence alone shifts the energy in the room. The table conversation began awkwardly, like nobody was sure what tone to set. There were a few obligatory jokes, a couple of half-hearted compliments about the wine list, but the tension lingered in the air like smoke. Everyone was feeling out the dynamic, trying to figure out what kind of night this would be. And then, the stories started. Not casual dinner talk. These were wild, bizarre anecdotes that came out of nowhere. There were tales about celebrity encounters, name-dropping galore, and the kind of self-congratulatory moments that made it clear this wasn't just dinner. It was a performance. As the night went on, the lines between entertainment and reality blurred. The louder voices began to take over, and one particular guest clearly felt the need to assert his larger-than-life persona. He leaned into outrageous statements, clearly enjoying the gasps and chuckles that followed. At one point, someone made a joke about the absurdity of the situation, but it only seemed to fuel the energy. The table wasn't laughing with anyone, it was laughing at the chaos of it all. It became evident that some of the people there weren't entirely sure what they'd signed up for. One or two guests sat back, sipping their drinks slowly, scanning the room as if trying to convince themselves this was all a dream. They watched as egos clashed and camaraderie was forced like a bad improv skit. Yet, even in the strangest moments, no one left. Everyone stayed, maybe out of curiosity, maybe out of politeness, or maybe just to see what would happen next. There was a moment during dinner when someone passed around their phone to show a photo, and the image somehow turned into a debate, loud and passionate, but mostly nonsense. No one really cared about the topic. It was about who could sound more confident, more sure of their own version of reality. That seemed to be the game at this table. Confidence was currency, and everyone was trying to spend it. At some point, the absurdity became the entertainment itself. The conversations didn't follow logic or any coherent theme. One moment it was about music, the next about international politics, and then suddenly a tangent about golf scores. But that was the point. It wasn't supposed to make sense. It was spectacle for the sake of spectacle, and everyone there, in their own way, played a role in the madness. The moment was almost too strange to believe. As the dinner rolled on and the wine continued to flow, the conversation began to drift into more serious territory. Topics that normally wouldn't come up around a table surrounded by entertainers, and high-profile figures trying to unwind. But somehow the energy shifted, and suddenly, out of nowhere, foreign policy was on the table, right next to the breadbasket and the half-eaten steaks. And that's when things took a surreal turn. The musician, known more for his rowdy persona and outlaw image than for any background in diplomacy or international affairs, leaned forward and started speaking with a level of certainty that caught everyone off guard. He didn't ask questions. He didn't offer humble opinions. He advised, like a man who'd just come from a classified briefing at the Pentagon. His tone was bold, almost casual, as if he'd spent years studying geopolitical strategy instead of playing guitar solos in front of pyrotechnics. What made it even stranger was how confidently he spoke, throwing out names of countries, referencing conflicts, and even suggesting what should be done in specific situations. He waved his fork like a pointer stick, using it to drive home his points as if he were giving a lecture rather than joining in on a late-night dinner conversation. There was no hesitation in his voice, no second-guessing, just pure, unfiltered certainty. The others at the table seemed unsure how to react. A couple of guests exchanged sideways glances, their faces frozen in polite expressions that hid a growing disbelief. One person coughed, maybe to suppress a laugh or maybe to break the tension, but the moment held firm. The musician just kept going, undeterred by the awkward silence or the subtle shifts in body language around him. He believed what he was saying. That much was clear. As he spoke, the surrealism deepened. He mentioned possible military strategies as if he'd written the briefings himself. He talked about negotiations with foreign leaders like he'd been in the room, shaking hands and making deals. There was something almost hypnotic about it, watching someone with absolutely no formal experience take on the role of a statesman, powered entirely by charisma and confidence. The entire table had gone quiet, not out of respect, but out of confusion. No one was sure whether to challenge him, humor him, or just let the moment pass. One guest stared down at his drink, swirling the ice like it might offer an escape. Another looked off into the distance, as though trying to remember how the night had started and how it had come to this. Eventually, someone cracked a joke, something lighthearted and slightly sarcastic. It was a small attempt to shift the vibe, to pull the conversation back to a place where it made sense. The musician laughed, maybe not catching the sarcasm, maybe not caring. Either way, the moment passed, and the table slowly returned to its original rhythm. But the energy had changed. Something unspoken lingered in the air. It was the realization that anything could happen in that room. Logic and expertise weren't requirements. All it took was the willingness to speak loudly and act like you knew exactly what you were talking about. What stuck with everyone wasn't just what was said, but how it was said. It wasn't about facts. It was about delivery. And that, more than any policy suggestion or geopolitical observation, was what left people talking long after the dinner was over. From the moment he took his seat, it was clear the evening would orbit around him. There was an energy, magnetic, chaotic, impossible to ignore, that shifted the tone of the dinner the second he opened his mouth. With a voice both familiar and forceful, he launched into conversation like a performer stepping onto a stage, commanding attention with every word, every gesture, every smirk. The topics came fast and loud, like someone flipping through channels without ever settling on one. 1 minute it was sports, then media, then politics. There was no clear thread, just a steady stream of commentary that bounced from subject to subject, connected only by ego. He had a way of making every story sound like a victory lap, even the ones that didn't seem to have a point. Every detail was exaggerated, every anecdote sharpened for dramatic effect. It didn't matter whether what he said was true, what mattered was how it sounded. Everyone at the table seemed to recognize the routine. Some leaned in, amused, soaking it all in, like fans at a live show. Others sat back, quietly observing, trying to decode the rhythm of his rambling. But no one interrupted. That wasn't how this game worked. When he talked, people listened, whether out of curiosity, confusion, or sheer disbelief. At one point, the conversation turned to a familiar theme: crowd sizes. Numbers were tossed out like stats from a sports game, with pride in every syllable. The tone was boastful but oddly specific, like he'd memorized them just in case this topic came up. There were stories about people chanting his name, about cameras trying to keep up, about moments of history that seemed to live mostly in his own telling of them. And when it came to his critics, oh, he didn't hold back. The list was long, and no one was spared. He called them liars, losers, phonies, with the kind of flair that made the insults almost theatrical. Some at the table chuckled nervously, unsure whether to agree or steer the conversation somewhere safer. But he wasn't interested in safety. He thrived in friction, in stirring things up and watching people squirm. Even his body language played a part. He leaned forward when he wanted to drive a point home, used sweeping hand gestures to emphasize a punchline, and paused dramatically before delivering the kind of statement that begged for reaction. It was all part of the performance. A routine honed over years of being the loudest voice in any room. What stood out most was the complete lack of filter. There was no attempt at subtlety or diplomacy. If something crossed his mind, it came out of his mouth unedited. That kind of bluntness can be refreshing in small doses, but here it was relentless. There was no room for nuance, no interest in hearing opposing views. It was a monologue disguised as conversation, and yet no one walked away. That's the strange part. The people at that table, some amused, some baffled, stayed. Maybe they were curious. Maybe they just wanted to see how far it would go, or maybe they understood what kind of night this was. Less about meaningful dialogue, more about watching a spectacle unfold in real time. As the night wore on, his voice never faded. If anything, it grew louder. His stories more elaborate, his gestures more animated. He didn't need approval. He needed an audience. And that night, for better or worse, he had one. The entire evening felt like something out of a dream, or maybe a fever dream, the kind that lingers with you long after you wake up, leaving behind only fragments that don't quite add up. From the very beginning, there was something off about the energy in the room. It wasn't just the odd combination of guests or the unexpected setting. It was the way everything unfolded, like the night had its own strange script, and everyone was just trying to figure out their lines on the fly. There were moments when it felt like time slowed down. A joke would land awkwardly, leaving the table in that delicate pause between laughter and silence. Someone would launch into a story that seemed to go nowhere, yet everyone listened politely, as if afraid to interrupt whatever strange rhythm the night had settled into. There was no clear flow to the conversation, no structure. One moment they were talking about classic rock, the next about national security, then suddenly reminiscing about a random celebrity encounter in Las Vegas. It was a whirlwind of ego, nostalgia, and confusion, and nobody seemed to be steering the ship. Every time the mood seemed to stabilize, it would tilt again, like a boat in choppy water. The topics bounced like a pinball machine, never landing for more than a few seconds. Nobody was asking real questions. Nobody was trying to build a meaningful exchange. It was more about who could keep the spotlight the longest, who could throw out the wildest story or the most ridiculous opinion and still be taken seriously, if only for the sake of keeping the night entertaining. The setting itself added to the disorientation. The lighting was dim, the walls decorated with framed photos of famous faces, all watching from their glass prisons as this bizarre dinner played out beneath them. The waitstaff moved silently, professionally, but their eyes flickered with curiosity. You could tell they were mentally recording every second, knowing they'd never see a dinner party like this again. And who could blame them? The dynamic at the table was unlike anything most people ever experience. There were people who clearly didn't belong together, not socially, not intellectually, not philosophically, but here they were, all pretending it made sense. Some of them leaned into it, playing their roles, laughing when expected, throwing in their own outlandish takes just to stay in the mix. Others sat back, almost detached, watching it all unfold like audience members at a very strange play they hadn't auditioned for. The absurdity reached a point where it almost became normal. That's the trick of nights like this. They twist reality just enough to make the bizarre feel routine. At some point, someone passed around a phone with a meme that sparked a full-blown discussion on media bias. A minute later, the same group was debating whether classic rock is dead. The transitions made no sense, yet nobody questioned them. It was all part of the vibe. What made it even more surreal was how no one seemed to be fully grounded. Everyone was half in, half performing, lines blurred between sincerity and showmanship. Were they really sharing their thoughts or just trying to top the last person's punchline? Was the laughter real or just a signal that they were playing along? No one could be sure. And still, it continued. On and on, like a carousel with no stop button. Dishes were cleared, drinks refilled. The stories grew more animated, the logic more loose. The whole experience teetered on the edge of ridiculousness, and somehow, that became its own kind of entertainment. By the end of the night, no one could quite put into words what had just happened. It wasn't the kind of dinner you could describe in neat bullet points or summarize over coffee the next morning. It was too bizarre, too fragmented, too laced, with moments that didn't seem real, even while they were happening. It felt less like a social gathering and more like stepping into an alternate dimension where the usual rules of conversation, decorum, and logic didn't apply. Everyone left with something different. For some, it was amusement, pure entertainment, value from watching egos clash and personalities collide in ways that would be considered outlandish anywhere else. For others, it was a deep sense of confusion, maybe even disbelief, that such a dinner had unfolded with no script, no purpose, and certainly no boundaries. A few left quietly, heads down, their expressions unreadable. They had entered expecting a typical evening and exited with a story they weren't sure they'd ever fully explain. It wasn't just the content of the conversations that lingered, it was the tone, the bravado, the overconfidence, the strange mix of charm and chaos that seemed to define every second. There were moments of laughter, yes, genuine from the gut laughter. But there were also moments where the room felt heavy, where silence filled the space between monologues, where people looked around and wondered, is this really happening? The evening never climaxed in the way you'd expect. There was no big dramatic outburst, no final toast that brought everything full circle. Instead, it faded out slowly, like a show running too long with no real finale. One by one, people began making excuses. Early meetings, travel, the usual polite lies. That signal it's time to go. The group that once buzzed with overlapping voices and exaggerated stories was now reduced to a few stragglers, still talking, still holding court, as if the performance couldn't end until the last light was off. What stayed with them, what would stay with anyone who'd been there, was the strange realization that this wasn't just about a dinner. It was a snapshot of a bigger truth, that in certain circles, reality can be bent, ego is the currency, and performance often replaces authenticity. The room had been filled with people used to commanding attention, used to getting the last word. And when too many people like that gather in one place, the result is rarely a coherent conversation. It's a spectacle. So they left, some shaking their heads, some laughing to themselves, a few already rehearsing how they'd retell the story later, spinning it just enough to make themselves sound wiser, funnier, or more removed than they actually were. But deep down, they all knew they'd been part of something strange, maybe even important, not because of what was said, but because of what it revealed. Nights like that don't happen often, and when they do, they don't leave clean memories. They leave impressions, a vibe, a weird taste you can't quite describe. And maybe that's the most honest thing that can be said about it. It wasn't normal, it wasn't clear, but it was unforgettable.